There comes a moment when the question disappears. Not because life finally answered you, but because something inside you no longer asks. No urgency, no searching, no silent bargaining with time. And if you don't recognize this moment, you'll keep looking for proof long after the door has already closed behind you. Tonight, you are here to discover something subtle, almost imperceptible, yet decisive. The most reliable signs that you're already there are the ones your mind was never trained to notice. By the end of this journey, you won't be looking for confirmation anymore. You'll understand why arrival is quiet. Stay with me, because this truth only reveals itself after the seeking finally dissolves. The question, "Is it done?" does not arise from curiosity. It arises from conditioning. From a lifetime spent being rewarded for vigilance, correction, and constant monitoring. From a world that taught you that if you are not checking, you are careless. If you are not adjusting, you are falling behind. So when you step into conscious creation, that reflex comes with you. Even when you understand Neville's words, even when you live in the end, even when you assume the state, the mind still whispers, "Shouldn't there be a sign by now?" That whisper feels innocent. It feels reasonable, but it carries an old identity, because the fulfilled state does not ask, it rests. Neville warned that the moment you begin to look for confirmation, you have already stepped out of the state you occupied. Not because you failed, but because checking itself is a form of returning. Returning to the version of you that needed reassurance to feel safe. Now here is what almost no one explains. The question doesn't disappear instantly. It fades. At first you notice it less often. Then you notice it without obeying it. Then one day you realize it hasn't appeared at all. That absence is not emptiness. It is stability. The mind is no longer scanning reality to decide how it should feel. And that shift is monumental. Because for the first time, your emotional state is no longer outsourced to circumstances. This is why people often miss this sign. They are waiting for excitement, but what arrives instead is quiet self-containment. Helene Hadsell described this phase as feeling strangely ordinary, not victorious, not triumphant, just settled. She did not wake up thinking about what she wanted. She lived, and living is the signature of arrival. Now pause here with brutal honesty. How often do you still ask the question? Not aloud, internally. And more importantly, how much authority does that question have now? If it arises and passes, you are already much further than you think. So, let's mark this moment gently. In the comments, write a simple observation. No story, no explanation. I'm not checking. Not as a vow, not as a promise, as recognition. Because recognition is how the mind learns that something has already changed. And once the mind learns that, it stops interfering. Now continue with me, because the next sign is even quieter. One of the most misunderstood experiences on the path of assumption is emotional neutrality. People are prepared for excitement. They are prepared for joy. They are prepared for disappointment. They are not prepared for calm. So when calm arrives, they misinterpret it. They say, "I don't feel the same drive anymore. I'm not as emotionally invested. Did I lose the desire?" No, you lost the tension. And tension was never fuel. It was friction. Neville explained that the feeling of the wish fulfilled is relief. Not elation, not thrill, relief. Relief is the absence of strain, and when strain disappears, so does emotional urgency. This is why the desire stops screaming. It doesn't leave, it settles. But the mind equates intensity with importance. So when intensity fades, the mind panics. It thinks, if I don't keep feeling something, nothing will happen. That belief belongs to the old state. The fulfilled state does not need emotional maintenance. It exists. Helene didn't sustain excitement, she sustained identity. And identity does not fluctuate with mood. This is why emotional neutrality is one of the clearest signs of arrival. You are no longer leaning on the future to stabilize your present. You are not emotionally bargaining with time. The desire is no longer a remedy, it is a fact. Now listen carefully. If your desire no longer defines your emotional highs and lows, you are already there. That is not detachment, that is possession. People confuse obsession with commitment, but obsession belongs to lack. Commitment belongs to certainty, and certainty is quiet. This is also why people sometimes feel a strange drop in motivation. They think something is wrong. But motivation is required when identity is not yet assumed. When identity is assumed, action becomes natural and motivation becomes irrelevant. So if you feel less driven, less frantic, less mentally busy, that is not loss, that is embodiment. Now at this point, some people try to reignite emotion because they fear stagnation. They visualize harder, they affirm louder. But that only recreates distance, because effort reintroduces separation. If you feel drawn to support this neutral phase without disturbing it, there is a 21-day challenge linked in the description and pinned comment. It's not about adding intensity, it's about protecting naturalness. Now return with me, because the next signs have nothing to do with emotion at all. The most reliable signs of arrival do not appear in what you say to others. They appear in what you stop saying to yourself. Before the shift, the mind negotiates constantly. It rehearses, it defends, it justifies, it explains. After the shift, that inner dialogue begins to dissolve, not because you silenced it, but because it lost relevance. You may notice that you argue less internally, rehearse conversations less, explain your choices less, fantasize less vividly. This alarms people. They assume imagination is fading, but imagination has simply moved from fantasy to fact. Neville taught that imagination speaks in feeling, not in chatter. When the feeling is settled, words are unnecessary, so the mental noise fades. This is not apathy, this is coherence. Another subtle change occurs here. You stop seeking validation, not because you reject others, but because your internal reference point has shifted. You know where you stand, and when you know where you stand, you don't ask others to hold you upright. This is one of the most profound signs of embodiment, because insecurity is noisy, certainty is silent. People who are already there do not convince, they occupy, and occupation is calm. If you've noticed that you talk less about your desires, that you feel less need to share plans, that you no longer defend your vision, that is not withdrawal, that is arrival. The desire is no longer hypothetical, it is positional, and positions don't negotiate. Now pause here. If this resonates, mark it. In the comments, write a simple phrase. It feels normal now, because normality is the ultimate sign of naturalness, and naturalness is the gateway Neville spoke of. Now continue, because the final signs appear not in your mind, but in how the world responds. When the outer world finally reflects the shift, it rarely announces itself. There is no climax, no explosion, just a quiet confirmation that feels expected. You might notice yourself saying, "I knew this would happen," and that reaction confuses people. They expected shock, but shock implies disbelief, and disbelief means you weren't there yet. When you are already there, confirmation feels logical, ordinary. like gravity doing what gravity does. This is the final sign. When the result arrives and it feels unsurprising, the arrival already happened internally. This is why manifestations often feel anticlimactic. The emotional event already occurred within you. The outer event is administrative, paperwork. Neville described the world as rearranging itself to mirror your assumption. The mirror does not celebrate, it reflects. And reflection is neutral. If you've noticed that you no longer fantasize about reactions, outcomes, or validation, that's because you already know how it feels. You're living it. And once you recognize that, seeking dissolves, waiting dissolves, life moves, quietly, precisely, inevitably. This channel exists not to amplify desire, but to help you recognize embodiment. If this way of seeing resonates, you may subscribe, not as an obligation, but as alignment. Because once you recognize the subtle signs you're already there, you stop searching for proof, and life stops delaying its reflection. Not because you demanded it, but because you finally understood that arrival was never loud. It was calm, it was stable, and it was already yours.